Henry Kissinger once said, "Those who need no introductions crave them the most." I am going to assume that is not true of my interlocutor today. Tony Blair is, well, Tony Blair. And so what I thought we would do is, since we have what is really an extraordinary and special opportunity, given the day that we are convening here, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, to start off with somebody who was one of the world's most powerful people on that day, and ask you, Tony, what were you doing when the first plane hit the first tower?
Well, Fareed, first of all, thank you for not introducing me. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the YES conference. I'm so pleased that it's able to happen with some semblance of normality, and it's great to be back in Kiev as well, and thank you everyone for attending. So that day, and we're speaking now around the time that it actually happened 20 years ago, at this exact moment actually. And I think it's first of all appropriate to remember the people that died, the victims, their families, and to just reflect that it was at that moment an event that changed our world, and it felt like that when it happened. So I was about to give a speech to the Trade Union Congress in Brighton in England, and I was just preparing the speech and putting finishing touches to it, and then I was summoned by one of my aides who said, "You've got to come through and see what's happening on the television there." And it was an incredible and terrifying and traumatic sight, and it's, I don't suppose anyone who is in any position of authority at that time will ever forget that day.
And in the weeks after that, you must have been thinking, is this the first of a series? What is going on?
Yeah, so the biggest anxiety we had was obviously what had happened was completely unprecedented. The world came to a stop. We were worried about how we kept our people safe. There could have been further attacks. We didn't know where they were coming from. For a long time after that, we would get threats, some of which were credible, against our infrastructure. We were having to shut things down. We closed our airspace, obviously, at that time, and kept it closed for some days. So you didn't know what to expect, but it completely changed people's perception of their security. And of course, the important thing was what did we do? What was to be done about this? And so in the days that followed, in close consultation with the American president, we tried to work out a strategy in consultation with other allies.
Did you immediately start thinking about the question that, I was editing Newsweek at the time, and there was this real public thirst or hunger to understand, why did this happen? And so I wrote in 3 days, I wrote a cover story, 7,000 words, called "Why They Hate Us." And I tried to kind of go through the roots of it. And I always wondered, how much did people in positions of power try to figure that out? Or were you so consumed with the fear that, there may be another one, that you were not able to start thinking about that?
No, we did have to think about it, because the question is really to identify what was the nature of the threat and what was the potential threat in the future. So we did think about that a lot. And, for me, I'd seen that there had been terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda against American forces. There have been several hundred people killed in Africa a short time, a few years before that. That you could see a pattern before that from this group, but the only military action I had been involved in prior to 9/11 was in Kosovo, where, in effect, we had gone to support ethnic Albanian Muslims who were under oppression from an authoritarian government in Serbia, from a Christian country. So we didn't perceive, I think, at that, until 9/11 happened, that this would be turned on us in our own country in this way.
So, most political figures inhabit one era pretty comfortably. So if you think of the 1990s and the 2000s, Bill Clinton is the classic figure of the 1990s, the internet boom, peace and prosperity, America astride the world. George W. Bush is very much a figure of the aughts, the war on terror, which really defined his presidency. You, I think, almost uniquely span both. And you are, in a sense, associated very strongly with both. You were the great New Labour figure who was very much Bill Clinton's partner, talking about technology and a pragmatic liberalism and all that kind of thing. And then 9/11 happens, and for a lot of your admirers, you morph into George W. Bush. How would you respond to people who say, and you know this, and there are people who admire you greatly who say this, Tony Blair was an amazing guy, third way, he, Bill Clinton, Schroeder, and then 9/11 happens and he becomes a neocon.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with this argument, as you might imagine. I mean, the two things to say are, first, I never stopped being New Labour all the way through. And actually, if you look at the reform programs in education and healthcare, law and order, technology, science, most of them happened in my second 5 years, not my first 5 years. So I carried on doing all of those things. But the second thing is 9/11 was a huge event. And it did give rise, obviously, to a whole set of decisions, but the first decisions we had to take were, first of all, for my country. Did we stand with America or not? Was this an attack on America or an attack on the West, on what we represented? And I felt very strongly it was an attack on us and not just them or you. And so, so began what was a new phase of policy, but all the way through, I was trying to make sure that at the same time as we were taking military action, rightly or wrongly, in pursuit of what we thought was necessary, there was a strong progressive component to what I was doing. So I always say to people, we also at that time, I put huge pressure on the revitalization of the peace process and the roadmap. We conceived of a trebling of aid to Africa and the poorest parts of the world, which was then followed by America when we held the G7 summit in 2005. And out of that came the largest life-saving program ever, the PEPFAR program in Africa. So I always, whatever the motivations of some of the people within the Republican Party for what happened, I was always trying to look at this still from a progressive point of view. But in the end, the thing that you find in government is that you have to take the decision. And ultimately, I had to decide whether to be with America or not. And I thought it was really important that America should not face this alone and that we should be with them. Now, of course, obviously, there are many people who disagree with that, but I took it for the reasons I stated. And I always say to people, one of the things that's really important when we look back on this 20 years, because different decisions are being taken now, is that we don't challenge each other's good faith. These are difficult questions. They're difficult to get right. But in the end, the thing you learn when you're in a position of power is that you get to decide the answers, but you don't always get to decide the questions.
So one of the things I wrote a lot about in those first few weeks was to highlight for people the strange role that countries like Saudi Arabia had played in this process. They were partners of the West, they were military allies of the West, but they had quietly, in a sense, through the back door, been funding, I saw this growing up in India. Every new mosque, every new madrasa, every new Islamic center was always funded by the Saudis, always with a Saudi-trained imam, who always taught the most fundamentalist, obscurantist, puritanical version of Islam that was highly intolerant, not always militant, as you know, that those things are allied, but not always advocating violence, but certainly always advocating extreme intolerance. And I wondered, for you and the Bush administration, was this a difficult dance to play? That you knew that Saudi Arabia was at some level the source of the problem, but at another level, a crucial ally, the swing producer of oil in the world. How did you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one of the problems when you are in government is that you're in the middle of everything, taking decisions all the time and with pressures coming on you. And one of the things I've been able to do since leaving office is with the institute that I have, we've been able to look at problems with much greater depth. And the truth of the matter is, I think we were not fully aware at that point of the origins of this threat. I think if we had been, it would have made quite a significant difference in some ways to how we approached it. So when there's an excellent paper that's been written by Dr. Eman al-Badawi in my institute, which published in the last few days, which I recommend to people because it shows you how this issue to do with Islamism, which is different from Islam. Islamism is the turning of the religion into a political ideology. It shows you the roots of it, and it shows you how it grew over a long period of time. And one of the elements of that was what happened in Saudi Arabia, especially after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when the Iranian Revolution is an event that everyone acknowledges and looks at and says, well, that was a huge political changer of the situation. But the other thing that happened later in 1979 was the storming of Mecca by those who, from the Sunni side, thought that the danger was that Iran would represent true, fundamentalist Islam, and they wanted to correct that from the Sunni side. And so there was the storming of Mecca. It was put down with enormous force in the end, but the Saudi government at that time decided out of that they would turn to a much more conservative view of religion. And of course, with the huge oil wealth, there was a budget given for those who wanted to export that philosophy. So around the world, there was then a well-financed campaign, not to support terrorism, that would be a mistake, but as you rightly say, to support a very conservative, very old-fashioned, and I would argue quite backward view of religion. So that doesn't mean that people were taught to be terrorists, but it does mean that a whole lot of countries ended up with their young people being taught some very, fundamental tenets, really at odds with the world, where you've got to get on across the boundaries of faith and culture and nation. So taught things about what it meant to be a good Muslim, taught things about how Islam had been betrayed by many of the people in positions of power in Islam, taught that those who are not Muslim are potentially your enemy, taught things about the Jews, obviously, which were highly anti-Semitic. So all of this then grew up, and what happened out of 9/11 didn't. It's really important to understand it has roots that go deep. And therefore, what is happening today, for example, in Saudi Arabia, where a lot of this is being changed, is of immense importance to dealing with the problem, because it cannot be dealt with purely by security means.
Another thing that happened in 1979, of course, was that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the Carter administration and then the Reagan administration made a fundamental decision, which is that they were going to arm the most violent opposition to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan which were these rural Pashtun warriors who are now the Taliban. Do you think, in retrospect, is there a lesson there about don't play with fire, or is it just the complexity of history?
Yeah, no, I think there is that lesson. One of the things I've learned in politics is that one of the worst sayings is, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's not true. And it's a very bad idea to think it is. So, no, yes, of course. And by the way, that was the reason we supported Saddam against Iran, which ended up with the Iran-Iraq war and 1 million casualties, and people forget about that now, but that period in the 1980s. So no, this was, in retrospect, you can say it was a mistake. I understand why it was done at the time.
So you mentioned the world of Islam today and how Saudi Arabia, Israel is very different, and it does seem to be. I mean, the dreaded religious police has been largely disbanded. Women have been given more significant rights, all under an absolute monarchy that is pretty brutal on political dissent, particularly, you know, the example of Jamal Khashoggi, who interestingly was my guide when I went to Saudi Arabia at the invitation of the Crown Prince at the time. So it tells you he was once very much in favor with the ruling family. How would you describe the world of Islam today? I find myself quite optimistic in the sense that many of the places that people worried about the most, Indonesia, Malaysia, even Pakistan, India, with large Muslim populations, you know, the fear was always you're going to have these tens of millions of Muslims recruited to this cause. You see much less of that. You see moderates more comfortable. You see people like the Saudis and the UAE not only doing what you were describing, but publicly saying they're doing this. I was struck by a tweet from the UAE embassy in Washington saying, the United Arab Emirates is the most open and diverse country in the Middle East, and our values are aligned with those of the United States of America. Now, I don't think they would have, you know, in the tweets in 2001 were how they were pure Islam and things like that. How important, you know, describe what you see as a shift that you've been watching for 20 years.
Yes, so I think there is a real shift, and there are many more people willing to come out and stand up, and you know, I noticed the attitude, for example, to Israel really shifting within the Gulf countries and many Arab states, many African nations. So I think there's a lot that is good news. We're actually publishing in the next couple of days a very extensive poll of people in the Middle East and North Africa and their attitudes to, for example, the role of women, the role of religion in politics. And, you know, on the whole, it's pretty good news. There is a shift to more liberal values, to more open-minded tolerance of others. So all of that is good. The trouble is it is contested. And you have places, particularly because of the work my institute does in Africa, I see a lot of this. This has grown in Africa in a way that I think if you had any African president here, certainly from the Sahel group of countries, but other countries like Mozambique, you know, if the president of Mozambique were here and you were asking what his top 3 challenges are, I would say that security would be either top or very nearly the top, and that wouldn't have been the case a few years ago. And so you've got that happening. Now, of course, you've got Afghanistan back governed by the Taliban. I think in other countries, if you look at Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, I think there are real voices standing up for what I would call open-minded tolerance, but there are still very strong strands of Islamism as well. And I do think, although this is obviously very contested by people, personally I believe you have to fight the ideology and not just the violence. In other words, that even, I'm not suggesting those people who are Islamists and pursuing Islamism without violence, obviously it's an ideological battle, not a security battle. But I do think it's important that the concepts behind Islamism are also challenged, and that we encourage people within Islam to say why it is wrong to turn the religion into a political ideology in this way, and we should be encouraging the voices that are coming forward now from many clerics, giving a view of the Quran and the Hadith which is completely consistent with open-minded tolerance and starts to reflect a bit more the process the Christians went through over a long period of time, where people say, yeah, well, the Bible may say that, but you're not going to apply that literally. You need to absorb the spirit and apply that in a more intelligent and a more sensitive way. Because in the end, look, what you realize is the world works today by people being open-minded, creative, and tolerant of difference. And all of our societies can only succeed on that basis. So anything that ends up dividing people according to faith or culture, it's got to be negative, ultimately.
So you brought up Africa, which I think is a very good place to sit for a moment, because it feels like this is a case where one could try to apply the lessons from the last 20 years. So we have to contest the ideology, and as you've written often, at the end of the day, only Muslims can engage in that. Outsiders can help, but ultimately it's a debate within Islam about what Islam should look like. Then the question is, should you contest militarily, and how should the Western world contest militarily? So when you look at a place like Africa, this is we're not just debating history now, which we will, but my question to you is, with the lessons of 20 years, would you send in large numbers of Western troops into African countries, even if those governments asked you for them? I mean, one of the features of the British Empire that people don't know is very often the Brits were asked by various people in India, local elites, please come, send in your troops so that you can beat up my enemies and then I can be in charge. How should we think of this problem of the use of military force to beat decidedly bad people?
Yeah, so this is where, in my view, and I tried to be reflective rather than defensive of the decisions that we took. I think it's possible to conceive of a combination of help around security and help around development, because for a lot of these countries, the violent people will prey on local disputes, local difficulties, local tribal or ethnic differences. I think it's possible to come, based on the experience of the last 20 years, to what I would call a more sustainable course of help for countries that need help, but where, if we did what we did in Afghanistan or Iraq, I don't think that's going to happen again in that way. But if you take those Sahel group of countries now, that's the countries that are in that northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, just underneath North Africa, and those countries are in a very serious state today, and the anarchy in Libya has greatly boosted the instability in those countries. But they have the following things in common, most of these countries. They have exploding populations, a large amount of poverty, weak institutions, and radicalization. So these governments are struggling. Now, one of the things you learn is that you cannot do development unless there's security. So you've got to secure the space. If these groups are able to operate with impunity, then it's impossible to do development, because you don't have any stability within which the development can take root. So we need to be able to help these countries, and that will require us to make a commitment. Now, it doesn't need to be a commitment in the same way that we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. It could be, for example, as we were in Afghanistan, after 2014, when we went to a mission that was more to assist the local forces. But you can decide that, but the reality is none of these situations will be governable unless you have at least some force on the ground. Okay, it doesn't always need to be ours, but there needs to be the ability to control the space. And the second thing then is to work on the politics and the social development that is necessary to help those countries. Now, in the Sahel at the moment, we're doing a little bit of both, but not enough of either. And France, frankly, has been left to carry the main military burden. Obviously, for President Macron, this is incredibly difficult, right? So he's under pressure to withdraw because obviously the risks of French troops being there are great. My point is the West needs to work out its strategy. It needs to decide what we should do to help, what's the best combination of security and development measures, and we need to treat it, I would say, particularly from the European perspective, as a very serious threat to us. Because otherwise, you're going to get extremism and waves of migration coming out of that. And, they're a short distance from Europe. One other thing that I think is raised by this is what does Europe do? And for these purposes, I include Britain. We're incapable of acting in any of these situations without America. So at some point, we're going to have to think our way through that because it's on our doorstep. The Middle East is on our doorstep. And the one thing that I think is clear from recent times in the US is there is no appetite in the US to play the role that was played immediately after 9/11.
Does that mean you would endorse what President Macron sort of flirted with, which was talk of building up Europe's capacity, but particularly its capacity to do force projection in a way that right now you can only do if you piggyback on America?
Yes. I mean, the reason I started European defense in the year 2000 with President Chirac then, so Britain and France, was because of my experience in Kosovo. I mean, I was lucky that President Clinton, without any great support actually in America, it wasn't a big issue in America, but he committed America, and that commitment was in the end what toppled Milosevic and effectively changed the situation. But the lesson for me out of it was that without America, there's nothing we could have done. So I think this has got to be seriously thought through. And even if Britain is outside of the European Union, there's no reason why we can't cooperate on defense, consistent with NATO, of course. But we need to develop that capability. And if we don't have that capability, and America's not prepared to commit in the same way that it has done previously, we're left with a void.
So you talk about assisting and helping these local governments. And the question I have about that, and this now just gets us to Afghanistan, isn't the problem ultimately that those governments that are so dependent or become so dependent on foreign support, particularly Western support, become inherently delegitimized by some local opposition, some local insurgency that can claim the mantle of nationalism? So if you look at what happens in Afghanistan, ultimately, I mean, there was a very good book by an American soldier, Carter Malkasian. He says basically the difference was very simple. The Taliban soldiers were fighting for God. The Afghan army soldiers were fighting for money. And the kind of mythology around that became so large. So you had this government, which we called a democracy. In the last election, 1.8 million Afghans voted in a country of 40 million people. It was a country we called independent, but 80% of its revenues came from foreign aid. It had a defense budget provided by America that was larger than its GDP. Its army could only fight using American Air Force, American logistics, American intelligence, American know-how. I remember a general telling me that his program for retraining the Afghan army began with teaching them how to read, because he said otherwise they can't read our manuals. And I said to him, General, do the Taliban know how to read? Because they seem to know how to fight pretty well without reading. And it always struck me that this was the problem. And I sympathize, which is you go in there from the outside, you want success fast, so you throw resources at the problem. But in throwing those resources, you're overwhelming a country and creating a kind of puppet regime.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the most difficult things in these situations is you either go all over on this side of the argument or you go all over on the other side. And for sure, many times in the last 20 years, people were wildly over-optimistic. But one of the things that I think has been most interesting, talking to Afghans and hearing them in these last few weeks, is that, yes, all of those things are true, but there was also real progress. You know, the girls going to school was real. The development of Kabul into a completely different city from how it was in 2001 was real. Almost 70,000 Afghan soldiers died. Those people were fighting for their country. And, you know, one of the things that I think is important is to realize that part of the difficulty was that over these last few years, it was becoming pretty obvious that the United States, at least, did not really want to stay. Now, the thing that I think when you're fighting these groups you have to realize is, number one, they don't think 20 years is a long time. We think 20 years is a long time. They don't think it's a long time. That's why I always say to people, when you look at the Iranian regime and what are they trying to achieve and what are they trying to do, don't be under any doubt. They want to acquire nuclear weapons capability, and they're happy to go through deals, no deals. They'll wait us out. Okay. And the second thing is that, and this is where we've got to be extremely careful because of the signal it can send to the people we're trying to push back against. Basically, what they think, these groups, is that if they hit us really hard and cause maximum death, maximum destruction, maximum destabilization, we will take that as a signal that we should get out. But if you look at the incentive structure you're creating, I mean, it's not really very helpful for your objective. In the end, we need to adjust our policy so we get the right mix of, as I say, security and development. But having come to a view, we've got to have the staying power to see it through, because if we don't, then of course what happens is the people we're working with locally, people in the government, people in the provinces, they end up thinking, well, are these people really with us or not? Do we then have to make a deal, a side deal with the Taliban, because otherwise they're going to be coming back? And you know, when we look at the morale of the Afghans, I think we've got to reflect on the February 2020 agreement. I mean, you're fighting alongside America for almost 2 decades. You are taking heavy losses. I mean, a lot of those people died. Right? You wake up one day and find that the people you're fighting alongside as your big ally have done an agreement with your enemy in respect of which you weren't consulted. Now, I guess that probably would have a demoralizing effect. So I think all the things you say are absolutely valid, but I think there's another side of the argument, and my point is, in the end, it's whatever strategy we decide upon, you've got to hold to it. And the problem with Western politics today is it thinks in short-term electoral cycles, and the people we're up against have no consideration of that at all.
So this is an important point because we are in Ukraine, and they are, you know, naturally people are wondering about the West's credibility and its staying power. And I guess I would push back and just ask you how you respond to this, which is, we say this about Western democracies, but the United States stayed more than twice as long in Afghanistan as the Soviet Union did, which had no public pressures to worry about. We stayed as longer, Tony, than the British Empire did. There is no 20-year period in the 19th century when Victorian Britain was able to sustain what America did. I think the problem was it wasn't working. You know, by 2015, 35% of the country was run by the Taliban. Yes, it was the rural areas, but that's where they were powerful, and the effort to completely exclude them had simply not worked. And in that sense, it is a bit like Vietnam, where you say to yourself, do you keep doing this knowing that ultimately you're not getting to a better place, or do you admit that it isn't working? I mean, I think if you think about Western staying power, and you should take some credit for this, but I mean, the United States is still on the banks of the Rhine. We are still in Okinawa. We are still in South Korea. But those governments don't need American forces to fight an internal, insurgency. They are protecting from external foes. So I would say to the Ukrainians, yeah, if you needed American troops to sustain, to quell something that was a domestic issue, that's tough. But if you want a deterrence against an external foe, we've got a pretty good track record in the West.
Yeah, it's a fair point. But here's the thing: if it matters to us to keep Afghanistan from going back into the hands of the Taliban, and therefore providing a safe space for these other groups, which I think will happen, then it's important that we at least take the decision as to what our position is going to be in relation to the country with some real deliberation and a discussion amongst allies. And, it's not as if the 20 years was all at the same tempo or the same depth of commitment. I mean, the truth is, over the last 10 years, it was a sustainable position. I believe it was a sustainable position, or it could have been, but you can have a debate about that. But at the end of 2019, they did a poll, and the Taliban had about 4% support amongst the population. So in the end, we should be clear, and this is where I think the analogies with Vietnam are wrong. In the end, the problem was not that the people wanted the Taliban. The problem was that the Taliban were determined to take the country. They were obviously supported externally as well. And in the end, that desire was greater than our desire to continue to support it, even though I pay enormous tribute to the American forces, the British and forces of other countries, the NATO troops. They did an amazing job. And also, by the way, when people think back and they think, well, was it worth it? I think the Taliban will find it hard to return to how things were in 2001. I forget the exact percentage of the population is under the age of 25, but I think it's over half of the population. It's going to be, who knows what will happen in Afghanistan in the future. But in the end, I guess my sort of final thought on it is, we have to decide what our policy is. We should learn the lessons of all the last 20 years, but let that be a decision based on strategy, based on deep analysis, based on deliberation with our allies, and not something that's done as a result of what I would say is reasonably short-term politics, even though I completely understand the pressures political leaders are under.
So let me ask you finally about Iraq, and I'm going to ask you a slightly different question than perhaps you're expecting, because this has been litigated for so many times that I know you're tired of it. So I'm going to ask it to you a different way, which is, this is the quiet little success right now. Afghanistan has collapsed, but Iraq is actually a functioning democracy. It's a corrupt, mismanaged democracy, but they have elections. They have this balance of power between the three groups. The Kurds did not secede. The Shia have not become pro-Iranian vassals. The Sunni have managed to hold their own. Again, it's very messy and imperfect, but this is an extraordinary, quiet limited achievement, it seems to me. Part of it, I would argue, is because the great genius of the surge under David Petraeus was to bring back the Baathists and the radical Sunnis so that everyone was now in the tent, and I wonder whether there's an analogy there with the Taliban and what we should have done. But I just wondered, it's very fragile, and Iraq could crumble again. But I wondered what your thoughts are, keeping in mind people will have their own view about whether it was ever worth the cost. And I think the cost was so horrendous that you can well come to the view that it wasn't worth the cost. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what does it look like on the ground today?
Well, I think there are real signs of stability in the country. And I keep in touch with people there and talk to them. I mean, the problems are still huge, but no, at the moment, there's a greater sense of hope. I want to answer it, though, by taking one step back and putting everything within the same context. You see, obviously, post 9/11, there was the events in Afghanistan, the events in Iraq. But there was something else that happened. So between 2003 and 2011, other than Iraq, which went through its incredibly difficult period, but in 2010 they had an election, again with a non-sectarian outcome, actually. All over the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, not a single government changed hands. If you'd gone to Damascus or in Cairo in December 2010, you'd have seen it relatively at peace, right? So the Arab Spring happened in 2011. And what happened in the Arab Spring was that people came out against the status quo, which they regarded as repressive and dictatorial, and they wanted something different. But two groups of people came together to overthrow the status quo, very much like they did in Iran in 1979. The liberals and the Islamists. And what happened, when people talk about the Arab Spring, which then, of course, created all the difficulties we see in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, what happened in the Arab Spring is that in the end, the Islamists had superior organization, and the liberals found it difficult, with all the problems that they had, to gain traction. So when you take a step back and you look at the problems in Iraq or in Afghanistan, you look at the problems all over North Africa and the Middle East, in the end, in my view, it's the same struggle. The question is, can people get to rule-based economies and religiously tolerant societies? Because in the end, that is the only thing that works. And I think it's possible to see the whole of the history, pre-2001 and post-2001, as really about that struggle. And that's where it comes back to where we started at the beginning of our conversation, which is, what is the future of Islam? Can it find its way to retrieving the religion from those people who want to abuse it, and find its way to a modern interpretation of it that means that it's coexistent with other religions and believes in the principles of respect for difference and cooperation across the frontiers of faith and culture. That's why what happened between the UAE and Israel is so fundamentally important, because that's the future. And when I think about what policy should be going forward, yes, we should do the security measures when we need to do them, but the single most important thing is that we join forces with those who are trying to reach that liberal, tolerant, modern view of religion, and we combine with them so that in the end you defeat the idea and not just the violence associated with it.
Tony Blair, thank you.